On a quiet Tuesday morning, a woman in faded jeans walked into my bank. By the time she left, our multi-billion-dollar institution was no more. It was a Tuesday. Tuesdays are the worst, you know? The weekend is a distant memory, and Friday is a mirage on the horizon. It's the day for tedious paperwork and customers with the most complicated, time-consuming problems. I was a senior client relationship manager at a downtown branch of a major bank, which is a fancy way of saying I was glorified customer service for people with a little more money than average. I thought I had seen it all. I was wrong. The morning rush had just died down, and I was catching my breath staring at the security monitor when she walked in. She didn't look like our usual clientele. We were in the financial district. Our regulars were all sharp suits, designer handbags, and the kind of expensive shoes that never touch a puddle. This woman was wearing faded jeans, a plain gray sweater that had seen better days, and a pair of simple sneakers. She carried no purse, just a phone in one hand. She walked past the teller line and came straight to my desk. "I can help the next person in line," I said, gesturing vaguely towards the velvet rope stanchions without making eye contact. I was busy trying to reconcile a transaction for a hedge fund guy who was convinced we'd shorted him 73 cents. "I don't need a teller. I need to make a withdrawal," she said. Her voice was calm, level. It had a quiet authority that made me finally look up. She was a black woman, maybe in her early 40s, with her hair tied back in a simple, elegant knot. There was an intensity in her eyes that was unsettling. "Okay," I said, leaning back in my chair, putting on my professional, slightly condescending smile. "Debit card withdrawals are at the ATM, and for anything else the tellers will be happy to assist you." "The amount is too large for a teller or an ATM," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "It requires manager approval." I sighed internally. This was going to be one of those transactions. Probably a check she'd just deposited that hadn't cleared, and now she wanted the cash. It happened all the time. "And what amount would that be, ma'am?" She stated a number. I almost laughed. It was an astronomical figure. More cash than we even kept in the main vault. It was the kind of money that gets moved electronically, with days of planning and paperwork, not withdrawn on a whim on a Tuesday morning. "Ma'am, with all due respect, nobody just walks in and withdraws that kind of liquid asset," I said, my smile tightening. "There are federal regulations, verification procedures. It's a process that takes days, sometimes weeks. I'm aware of the procedures. I'm also aware of my account agreement," she said, her voice still perfectly even. "It stipulates same-day access to my funds, provided I give branch notice. Consider this my notice." This was absurd. I looked her up in the system. Her name was Dr. Alani Vance. And then I saw her account balance. My jaw went slack. The number she'd asked for was a tiny fraction of her total holdings. She was without a doubt the wealthiest individual to ever set foot in our branch. My condescension evaporated, replaced by a cold, prickling sweat. I stammered, I see. Dr. Vance. Of course. This is just a highly unusual request. I'll need to get my branch manager, Mr. Henderson." Henderson was a creature of habit and prejudice, a portly man in his late 50s who believed the world should run exactly as it did in 1985. He lumbered over, looked at my screen, then looked at Dr. Vance, his eyes sweeping over her plain clothes with visible disdain. "What's the problem here?" he grunted. I explained the situation in a hushed tone. Henderson's face clouded over. He saw the same numbers I did, but his brain couldn't connect the woman in front of him with the fortune on my screen. He saw a potential scam, not a high-value client. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Henderson said, his voice dripping with false politeness. "A wire transfer is the standard for a sum this large. We can't just hand over a duffel bag of cash. It's a security risk." "I don't want cash," Dr. Vance said patiently. "A cashier's check will be fine." made out to my name. Henderson crossed his arms. That still requires multiple levels of verification. We have to be careful. People like you, well, people often don't understand the complexities of these transactions. You'll have to wait. We can probably have it for you by Friday, maybe Monday. That was it. The final dismissive pat on the head. Dr. Vance just stared at him for a long moment. There was no anger in her eyes, just decision. She gave a single, slow nod. I see, she said softly. She took out her phone. It was a sleek, modern device, but it looked like any other. She tapped the screen once, put it to her ear, and said 5 words. 5 words that echoed in the marble-floored silence of the bank. It's happening. Pull it. All of it. She hung up. She didn't look at us. She just stood there, waiting. Not 10 seconds later, Henderson's private line, the red phone on his desk that connected directly to the regional head office, began to shriek. It was a sound I had heard only once before, during a citywide system failure. Henderson's face went white as a sheet. He scurried to his office, snatched up the receiver, and his confident bluster vanished, replaced by a choked, squeaking sound. He listened for a moment, his hand trembling, his eyes wide with pure, unadulterated terror. He stumbled out of his office a minute later, the phone still clutched in his hand, as if it were a venomous snake he'd just strangled. His face, usually a florid pink, was the color of old parchment. He was sweating profusely, his tie askew, his eyes darting around the room like a cornered animal until they landed on Dr. Vance. She hadn't moved a muscle. She just stood there, watching him unravel. "Please," Henderson wheezed, taking a clumsy step towards her. "Ma'am, Dr. Vance, there's been a misunderstanding. A terrible, terrible misunderstanding." She didn't respond. She just raised a single, questioning eyebrow. Behind the counter, the tellers were starting to look agitated. One of them, a young woman named Sarah, called out to me. "Mark, our systems just went down. All of them. I can't even process a deposit." My own monitor, which had been displaying Dr. Vance's frankly obscene account balance, suddenly flickered. A red banner flashed across the top. System-wide transaction freeze initiated. Code. Aegis. I had never seen that code before. None of us had. It sounded ominous. Final. "What did you do?" Henderson whispered, his voice cracking. He looked from his dead monitor to the silent woman who was the epicenter of this sudden, inexplicable chaos. "I did what you advised," Dr. Vance said, her tone as placid as a frozen lake. "I decided to wait. I just chose to wait somewhere else, and to take my assets, and the assets of my partners, with me." Partners. That word hung in the air. Henderson looked like he'd been physically struck. He staggered back and collapsed into his chair, his head in his hands, muttering something that sounded like, "Vance Capital Group." Oh God, no. Vance Capital Group. The name hit me like a ton of bricks. They weren't just a client. They were the client. VCG was a private equity firm that held accounts with our bank for dozens of their subsidiary companies and high-net-worth investors. They were a cornerstone of our branch's portfolio, representing a significant percentage of our total assets under management. It was the kind of client relationship managed at the corporate level, so far above Henderson and me that we never even saw the paperwork. We just saw the river of money that flowed through our branch because of them. My fingers flew across my keyboard, ignoring the flashing red banner, pulling up the master file for Vance Capital. My security clearance was just high enough to see the signatory list, and there it was, at the very top. Principal and sole managing partner, Dr. Alani Vance. The horrifying truth crashed down on me. She hadn't just initiated a withdrawal of her personal funds. Her call hadn't been to an assistant. It had been a kill switch, a command to her own firm to execute a pre-planned, systematic, and total liquidation of every single asset they held with our institution. not just from our branch, but from the entire bank, globally. As if on cue, every phone in the building began to ring simultaneously. The client lines, the internal extensions, even the fax machine started whirring. My own cell phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a regional alert, then another, and another. Outside, I could hear the distant sound of sirens growing closer. "You can't do this," Henderson babbled, looking up from his desk, his face a mask of desperation. "The markets, the liquidity crisis. You'll trigger a collapse." Dr. Vance finally tilted her head. A flicker of something, not pity, but perhaps cold, clinical assessment, passed through her eyes. "Your bank made a calculation," she said, her voice cutting through the rising cacophony. "You saw my clothes, you saw the color of my skin, and you decided I was not worth your time. You calculated that the risk of offending me was low. What you failed to calculate was that I am the one who holds your risk, and I am now calling it due." Then the world seemed to contract. The main vault alarm began to blare, a deafening, pulsing shriek. Emergency lights started flashing, casting the pristine marble floors in a hellish red glow. A heavy thud echoed through the bank as the automated security shutters began to slam down over the windows and the main entrance, plunging us into a state of artificial twilight. We were locked in, not for security from the outside, but to contain the crisis within. My monitor flashed a new message, one that made the blood freeze in my veins. "Branch quarantine protocol enacted. Regulatory seizure imminent." The noise was overwhelming. Alarms, ringing phones, the frantic, panicked voices of my colleagues trapped behind the teller line. But through it all, Dr. Vance remained an island of perfect calm. The emergency light strobed across her face, but her expression didn't change. She was no longer a participant in this chaos. She was an observer watching the predictable outcome of an experiment she had set in motion. Henderson, on the other hand, was completely broken. He was on the phone, presumably with someone very important and very angry, and his side of the conversation was a pathetic litany of, "Yes, sir," "I understand, sir," and "It was a judgment error, sir." He was a captain willingly going down with a ship he had just deliberately scuttled. That's when two men in dark, severe suits entered not through the main doors, which were sealed, but through the emergency exit by the vault. They moved with a silent, coordinated efficiency that screamed federal authority. They weren't cops. They were the men who clean up messes like this. The ones who arrive when a financial institution is no longer just failing, but has ceased to exist in the eyes of the government. One of them walked directly to Henderson, took the phone from his trembling hand, and spoke a few quiet words into it before hanging up. "Mr. Henderson," the agent said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, "your employment is terminated. Please collect your personal effects. You will be escorted from the building." The other agent approached Dr. Vance. There was a flicker of recognition, a slight dip of his head that was almost a bow. "Dr. Vance," he said respectfully, "we're here to facilitate the transfer. The acting Treasury Secretary is on a secure line for you whenever you're ready." She gave him a slight nod. "Thank you, Agent Miller. I'll take the call in a moment." She then turned her attention back to me. I had been frozen behind my desk, a deer in the headlights of a multi-billion-dollar freight train. I fully expected to be next on the chopping block, another piece of collateral damage in Henderson's spectacular failure. "You," she said, her voice cutting through my paralysis. "What's your name?" "Mark," I stammered. "Mark Dalton." "Mark," she repeated, tasting the name. "You were dismissive at first, but you hesitated. You looked me up. You deferred to your manager when you saw the reality of the situation. You followed protocol, even when your manager chose to ignore it." I just stared, unsure if this was an accusation or an acquittal. She continued, My firm will now be managing the liquidation of this bank's assets. It's a complex process. We'll need a transitional team, people who understand the infrastructure and the client base, people who can follow instructions and see what's in front of them, not what they expect to see. She held my gaze for a moment longer. The job will be twice the work, for 3 times the pay. My assistant will be in touch with an offer by the end of the day. If you want it. My mind reeled. A job offer. In the smoldering ruins of my career, she was handing me a life raft, a golden one. I managed to croak out a single word. Yes. Good, she said simply. With that, she turned her back on me, on the chaos, on the entire implosion of the bank branch. She walked with Agent Miller towards Henderson's now vacant office to take her call from the Treasury Secretary. As Henderson was being led out by the other agent, a broken man in a wrinkled suit, he caught my eye. There was a look of pure, uncomprehending bitterness on his face. He had lost everything because he couldn't see past a pair of faded jeans and the color of a woman's skin. I was being given the opportunity of a lifetime for the simple act of doing my job. The alarms were finally silenced. The phones stopped ringing. A heavy, funereal quiet settled over the branch. The few remaining staff were huddled together, whispering in shock. But I wasn't listening. I was watching the emergency exit close behind Dr. Alan Evans. She never once looked back. She hadn't shut down a bank in 10 minutes out of anger or spite. She had done it with the cold, detached precision of a surgeon removing a cancer. It wasn't personal. It was just business. And I had just been hired by the most formidable businesswoman I would ever meet. It was a Tuesday. Tuesdays, I decided, were for new beginnings.